The empty chair story. The studio lights cast their familiar golden glow across the Family Feud stage, but tonight there was something different in the air. It was Thursday evening, the kind of late taping that usually brought out the most relaxed energy from families and audiences alike. The day's tension had melted away, replaced by that comfortable anticipation that comes when everyone has settled into the rhythm of television magic. The iconic blue and orange set gleamed under the professional lighting, every surface polished to that perfect television shine that made even the most ordinary moments look extraordinary. The Family Feud logo blazed against the backdrop in letters that seemed to pulse with their own energy, and the familiar theme music filled the studio with its infectious optimism. But as Steve Harvey took his position at center stage, adjusting his charcoal gray suit and straightening his burgundy tie, he noticed something that made him pause. In the third row of the studio audience, among the sea of eager faces and enthusiastic smiles, there was an empty seat. Just one. Seat 3G, according to the small placard that ushers used to direct people to their places. In a studio filled with 300 people, one empty seat shouldn't have mattered. Shouldn't have been noticeable. But somehow, in the warm chaos of pre-show energy, that single vacant spot seemed to draw attention like a magnet, creating a small pocket of stillness in the midst of all that motion and excitement. Steve had been doing this long enough to know that empty seats told stories. Sometimes they represented last-minute cancellations, family emergencies, or simple changes of heart, but occasionally, they represented something much deeper. Tonight he had the feeling that empty chair was going to matter in ways he couldn't yet understand. At the left podium stood the O'Sullivan family from Boston, representing 4 generations of Irish-American resilience, and the kind of close-knit family bond that made for compelling television. Leading them was Margaret O'Sullivan, 67 years old, with silver hair that caught the studio lights and hands that bore the telltale signs of a life spent caring for others. Her weathered fingers, adorned only with a simple gold wedding band that had grown loose over the years, gripped the podium with the kind of determination that spoke to anyone who had ever carried more weight than they thought they could bear. Behind Margaret stood her family like a portrait of generational love. Her daughter Patricia, 45, a high school principal, whose stern classroom demeanor melted into obvious affection whenever she looked at her mother. Patricia's twin sons, Kevin and Sean, both 19 and home from their first year of college, tall and broad-shouldered like their grandfather had been, but with gentle eyes that suggested they had inherited their grandmother's compassion along with his stature. Completing the family was Margaret's youngest grandchild, 16-year-old Molly, whose auburn hair and bright green eyes made her look like a painting of Irish youth, full of possibility and life. The O'Sullivan family had driven 12 hours from Boston in a rented van, their journey funded by a combination of savings accounts, borrowed money, and the kind of family determination that refused to accept that anything was impossible if you wanted it badly enough. They had been selected for Family Feud after their 4th application, each previous attempt representing a different family crisis that had prevented them from making the trip. This time had been different. This time, they had made it to Los Angeles, checked into their modest motel room near the studio, and spent the evening before their taping sitting in a circle on the twin beds, practicing survey questions and sharing stories about the person who should have been there with them but wasn't. Across the stage stood the Rodriguez family from Phoenix, a vibrant collection of personalities who brought the kind of natural energy that producers love to see. They were loud without being obnoxious, competitive without being mean-spirited, and filled with the kind of easy laughter that made everyone around them feel welcome. The patriarch, Carlos Rodriguez, was a retired firefighter, whose booming voice could be heard over the studio audience even without a microphone. His wife, Elena, wore a dress she had sewn herself specifically for this occasion, the bright blue fabric chosen to complement the stage colors. Their 3 children, Maria, 28, Diego, 25, and youngest daughter Carmen, 22, had taken time off from their respective jobs to be here, understanding that this wasn't just a game show appearance, but a family celebration of the life they had built together. The contrast between the two families was striking and poignant. The Rodriguez family radiated the kind of complete togetherness that comes from never having experienced a significant loss. They moved as a unit, finished each other's sentences, and shared the unconscious confidence of people who had never doubted that their family was complete. The O'Sullivan family, by contrast, carried themselves with the careful consideration of people who understood that presence was precious, that the opportunity to be together couldn't be taken for granted, and that sometimes the people who should be standing with you could only be there in spirit. Steve worked the room during the warm-up with his signature blend of humor and genuine warmth, but he found his eyes drawn repeatedly to that empty seat in the third row. Something about it nagged at him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. In his years of hosting, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the energy in a room, to sense when there were undercurrents of emotion that might surface during the show. Tonight, that instinct was telling him that this episode would be different. The early rounds progressed with the kind of entertaining back and forth that made for good television. The Rodriguez family played with enthusiasm and flair, taking risks that sometimes paid off spectacularly and sometimes left them empty-handed. They celebrated every success loudly and took their failures with good-natured laughter, creating the kind of positive energy that lifted everyone in the studio. The O'Sullivan family, by contrast, played with careful strategy and quiet determination. They were methodical, thoughtful, and seemed to approach each question with the weight of people who understood that this opportunity couldn't be wasted. Their celebrations were more subdued, their disappointments more quickly absorbed and processed. They played like people who had learned that life was unpredictable, that victories were precious, and that every moment of joy needed to be appreciated while it lasted. By the fourth round, the score was closer than anyone had expected. O'Sullivan family, 89 Rodriguez family. The numbers represented more than just points on a scoreboard. They represented the collision of two different approaches to life, two different ways of handling pressure, two different definitions of what constituted success. Steve walked to center stage for what would be the pivotal question of the game, that moment when the momentum could shift decisively in either direction. He could feel the energy in the studio reaching its peak, that electric anticipation that separated routine entertainment from something memorable. The production assistants in the booth were leaning forward, the camera operators had found their perfect angles, and the audience was holding its collective breath. "All right, folks," Steve announced, his voice carrying that perfect blend of authority and warmth that had made him America's favorite game show host. "We've got ourselves a real battle here tonight. The O'Sullivan family from Boston, showing us what East Coast determination looks like. The Rodriguez family from Phoenix, proving that the Southwest knows how to bring the energy. But this next question," he paused for dramatic effect, letting the tension build. "This next question could decide everything." Margaret O'Sullivan stepped forward for the face-off, her movements deliberate and steady, despite the arthritis that made her mornings difficult. She had insisted on being the one to face off for this crucial round, overruling her children's concerns about the pressure. At 67, she had earned the right to make decisions for herself, and this was one moment when she refused to step aside for someone younger. Steve noticed the determination in Margaret's eyes immediately, but he also sensed something else, a sadness that seemed to run deeper than competitive anxiety. There was something in her expression that reminded him of his own mother during the final years of her marriage, when she had carried the weight of loving someone who was no longer there to love her back in the same way. "Margaret," Steve said gently, his voice dropping to that paternal tone that had comforted thousands of contestants over the years. "You ready for this one, sweetheart?" Margaret looked up at him with eyes that held decades of life experience, both beautiful and heartbreaking. "I'm ready, Steve. We're all ready." Steve studied her face for a moment longer, sensing that there were layers to this woman's story that went far beyond what was visible on the surface. "All right then, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Let's see what you're made of." He lifted the question card with theatrical flair, the same gesture he had made thousands of times, but somehow made feel fresh and important every single time. We surveyed 100 people, top 6 answers on the board. He paused, building the tension. Name something that makes a house feel like home. The question hung in the air with deceptive simplicity. It should have been straightforward, the kind of survey that generated predictable responses about family photos, familiar smells, comfortable furniture, or personal belongings. The kind of question designed to make families think about what they valued most, what made their everyday spaces feel special and meaningful. But as Margaret stood at the podium, her hand hovering over the buzzer, something shifted in her expression. The carefully maintained composure that had carried her through the earlier rounds began to crack, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. Her lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. Her eyes, bright and alert moments before, began to shimmer with unshed tears. 5 seconds passed, then 10. The Rodriguez family exchanged glances, ready to steal if Margaret ran out of time. But even they seemed to sense that something profound was happening. The studio audience, usually quick to offer encouragement or suggestions, found themselves holding their breath in anticipation. Steve's eyebrows raised slightly, that signature expression of gentle curiosity that had become one of his trademarks. "Margaret, you thinking hard about this one?" Margaret looked up at Steve, and for just a moment, her careful dignity cracked completely. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had been holding something heavy for far too long. "The people you love being there," she said softly, her Irish accent becoming more pronounced as emotion overwhelmed her usual careful speech. "Even when they can't be there anymore." The words fell into the studio like a stone dropping into still water, creating ripples of silence that spread outward until they touched every corner of the room. This wasn't just a survey answer, this was a confession, a revelation, a piece of someone's heart offered to strangers, because sometimes that's the only way to carry grief that has grown too heavy to bear alone. The studio audience didn't applaud or cheer. They simply sat in stunned silence, recognizing that they were witnessing something that transcended entertainment. Even the scoreboard, with its bright digital display ready to reveal whether Margaret's answer was on the board, seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of such raw honesty. Steve Harvey felt something shift in his chest, that familiar tightness that came when someone's story connected directly with his own experiences of love and loss. He set his question cards down on the nearest podium with deliberate care, the small action sending a clear signal that this moment had become about something much more important than the game. "Margaret," he said softly, taking a step closer to her podium, "can you tell me what you mean by that?" The question was an invitation, a gentle opening of a door that Margaret had been keeping carefully closed for months. She looked at Steve, really looked at him, and seemed to see past the television persona to the man who understood what it meant to love someone through loss. "My husband," Margaret began, her voice gaining strength even as tears began to flow down her cheeks. "Thomas. We were married for 45 years of setting the table for two, of saving the best stories for each other, of making every ordinary day feel special just because we were living it together." Steve felt his own throat tighten. In his decades of entertainment, he had learned to maintain professional distance, to be empathetic without becoming overwhelmed. But something about Margaret's quiet dignity, her refusal to ask for pity even as she shared her pain, cut straight through every defense he had built. "He passed away 6 months ago," Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the tears. "Peaceful in his sleep, the way everyone hopes to go. But what they don't tell you is that peaceful doesn't make it hurt less. Peaceful doesn't make the quiet house any less quiet." The studio had become a cathedral of attention. 300 people sat in absolute silence, witnessing something they instinctively understood was sacred. The cameras kept rolling, but everyone behind them seemed to have forgotten they were making television. "Every evening," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, "I still set the table for two. I put out his favorite mug, even though there's no one there to drink from it. I save up the funny things that happen during my day, even though there's no one there to share them with. Because that's what makes a house feel like home. The expectation of love, even when the person you're expecting can't walk through that door anymore. Steve took another step closer, his movement instinctive, the response of someone who recognized that this moment required proximity, not distance. He wasn't a game show host anymore. He was simply a human being trying to bridge the space between one person's grief and another's understanding. "Margaret," he said gently, "how are you managing? How are you getting through each day?" Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so simple and human that it seemed to strip away every pretense in the room. "Some days are harder than others," she admitted. "But I keep his picture on the kitchen table right where he used to sit, and every morning I make coffee for two. I drink one cup and I pour the other one out in the garden where he planted roses for our anniversary last year." The silence that followed was broken by a sound that started small and grew. Someone in the audience was crying. Then another. Soon, the gentle sounds of shared grief filled the studio, like a quiet symphony of recognition. "And you know what the hardest part is?" Margaret continued, looking directly at Steve with an intensity that seemed to see straight into his soul. "It's not the big things. It's not the anniversaries or the holidays. It's the small moments, when something funny happens and I turn to share it with him, but there's just empty space where he used to be. When I'm watching our old shows and I want to comment on something, but there's no one there to hear me. When I make his favorite dinner out of habit and then remember I'm the only one who's going to eat it." Steve Harvey, who had built a career on knowing exactly what to say in every situation, found himself struggling for words. But sometimes, he was learning, the most powerful response wasn't words at all. It was presence. It was witness. It was the simple act of standing with someone in their pain and letting them know they weren't alone. "Margaret," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "I need you to know something. And I need your family and everyone in this studio to hear this too." The studio fell silent again, waiting. "Love doesn't leave when people do," Steve said, his words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "What you're doing, setting that table, making that coffee, keeping his picture where he can watch over you, that's not just memory, that's love in action. That's what 45 years of marriage looks like when it refuses to be ended by something as small as death." The audience began to respond then, not with applause but with sounds of recognition, soft murmurs of agreement, gentle sobs of shared understanding. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a room full of people connecting over the universal experience of loving someone so much that losing them changes the very geography of your daily life. But Steve wasn't finished. He turned slightly to address the entire studio, his voice rising just enough to carry to every corner of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I need everyone here to understand what we just witnessed. This beautiful woman just showed us what real love looks like. Not the fairy tale kind, not the movie kind, but the everyday kind that keeps showing up even when there's no one there to notice." He turned back to Margaret, his expression gentle but determined. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I want you to know that Thomas didn't just make your house feel like home for 45 years. He's still making it feel like home right now. Every time you set that table, every time you save those stories, every time you water those roses, he's there. Love that strong doesn't just disappear because someone stopped breathing." The emotion in the studio was overwhelming now. Even the Rodriguez family had completely forgotten they were in a competition. Elena Rodriguez wiped tears from her eyes while her husband Carlos stood with his hand over his heart, visibly moved by Margaret's courage in sharing something so personal and profound. Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal business card. Not a prop, not something prepared for television, but the actual card he carried with his private contact information. "Margaret," he said, placing the card gently in her hands, "this has my personal number on it. I want you to use it on the days when that house feels too quiet, when the missing gets too heavy to carry alone. Because family doesn't end with blood, and it doesn't end with marriage vows. Sometimes family is whoever shows up when you need them most. Margaret looked down at the card through her tears, then back up at Steve with an expression of such gratitude and surprise that it made everyone watching understand how long she had been carrying her grief alone. But Steve had one more gesture to make. He looked out at the studio audience, his gaze stopping at that empty seat in the third row, the one that had been nagging at his attention all evening. "You see that empty chair right there?" he asked, pointing to seat 3G. "That's not an empty chair anymore. That's Thomas's seat. That's where he's been sitting this whole time watching his wife show 300 strangers what courage looks like." The cameras followed his gaze, focusing on the empty seat that suddenly seemed to pulse with significance. And then something accident happened. Without any prompting, without any direction from producers or floor managers, the entire studio audience stood up, not to applaud, not to cheer, simply to acknowledge the presence of someone who couldn't be seen but whose love was so palpable in that moment that everyone could feel it. They stood for a full minute in complete silence, 300 people paying respect to a man they had never met, but whose love they had just witnessed through the courage of the woman who missed him most. When they finally sat down, Margaret was crying openly, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of loneliness. They were tears of recognition, of feeling seen and understood, of realizing that love shared multiplies rather than diminishes. Steve walked around to Margaret's side of the podium and gently pulled her into a hug that encompassed not just her grief, but her strength, not just her loss, but her love, not just her yesterday, but her tomorrow. "Thomas," he said softly, speaking to the empty chair, to the watching cameras, to the millions of people who would eventually see this moment. "Your wife is going to be okay. She's got a family that loves her. She's got a studio full of people who see her strength. And she's got a love story that death can't touch. You did good, man. You did real good." The final applause, when it came, wasn't television applause at all. It was the sound of recognition, shared humanity, of people understanding that everyone has an empty chair somewhere. Everyone has someone whose absence shapes their presence. The game resumed eventually, but it was transformed. Both families played not as competitors but as celebrants of Margaret's courage. The final score became irrelevant. Both families were declared winners because some moments transcend the boundaries of games and prizes and television shows. When the episode aired 4 months later, it became more than just the highest-rated Family Feud episode in history. It became a cultural touchstone, a reminder of what television could be when it stopped trying to entertain and started trying to connect. Margaret received thousands of letters from widows and widowers around the world, from people who had never spoken about their empty chairs but found courage in her example. Support groups formed around the episode. Grief counselors used it as a teaching tool for healthy mourning. Wedding planners began incorporating empty chair ceremonies into their services for couples who wanted to honor absent loved ones. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret's house in Boston became a little less quiet. Her phone rang more often with calls from new friends who understood what it meant to love someone you couldn't see. Her table was set for 2 more frequently, as people stopped by to share coffee and stories and the kind of companionship that makes grief bearable. Steve Harvey kept his promise in ways that extended far beyond that initial gesture. He called Margaret on Thomas's birthday, on their wedding anniversary, on the ordinary Tuesdays when missing someone feels like a physical ache. He sent flowers for her garden on the first anniversary of Thomas's death, with a note that read simply, "Love that strong never really leaves." The empty chair in the studio became a symbol. Family Feud began dedicating one seat at every taping. Honor absent family members, creating what they called Thomas's seat, a place where love could be present even when people couldn't be. Margaret herself became a regular guest, not just on Family Feud, but on various talk shows, not as someone seeking sympathy but as someone offering hope. She spoke about the difference between grief that isolates and grief that connects, about the choice to honor love rather than just mourn loss, about the courage required to keep setting tables for people who won't be coming to dinner. Today, Margaret O'Sullivan still lives in the Boston house she shared with Thomas for 45 years. She still sets the table for two most evenings, but now it's often because someone is actually coming to share the meal. She still makes coffee for two every morning, but now she drinks both cups, one for herself and one in Thomas's memory, a daily celebration of love rather than a daily reminder of loss. The roses Thomas planted are thriving under her care, tended with the kind of devotion that transforms gardening into prayer. And sometimes, when she's working among the flowers in the evening light, neighbors say they can hear her talking to someone they can't see, sharing the stories of her day with the person who taught her that home isn't a place but a feeling, not a building but a love that refuses to be limited by something as temporary as presence or absence. The empty chair story became more than television. It became proof that the most powerful connections happen not in spite of loss, but because of love, not when everything is complete, but when we find the courage to honor what's missing while celebrating what remains. And in studios around the world, when television producers want to understand the difference between entertainment and impact, when they want to remember why stories matter more than ratings, they tell the story of Margaret O'Sullivan, the woman who taught a game show audience that the people who make our houses feel like home never really leave. They just change the way they love us.